The wind howled through the snowy peaks of the Alaskan wilderness as Sergeant John Carter trudged along, the weight of the cold pressing against him like an invisible force. It had been weeks since he'd felt any warmth, weeks since he had seen a friendly face or heard anything other than the sound of his boots crunching on the frozen ground. War had taken its toll on him, both physically and mentally. The soldier had once been full of ambition, driven by the idea of duty, honor, and service. But now, after countless battles and a string of missions that felt more like survival than victory, he was just tired. John and his unit had been stationed in the northern reaches of Alaska on what seemed like a routine mission, tracking down remnants of a rogue militia group that had fled into the wilderness. The cold was unbearable, and the mission dragged on with little progress. Tensions within the group were high, and it wasn't long before those tensions began to spill over. Then, disaster struck. One moment, they were moving through the trees, trying to stay out of sight, and the next, a blast shattered the silence, sending John flying to the ground. Pain exploded in his side as shrapnel dug into his flesh. The forest around him erupted in chaos, gunfire, screams and explosions all blending together in a nightmarish symphony. John's body was alive with pain, but his instincts kicked in, pushing him to crawl to a nearby tree for cover. As the sounds of the battle faded, John found himself alone, separated from his unit. His comrades were either dead or scattered. He couldn't tell who was alive. His radio had been destroyed, and the cold made it difficult to think clearly. Every step was a battle. His legs were already beginning to feel the effects of frostbite, and the blood from his wound soaked into the thick layers of his clothing. Alone in the wilderness, John knew survival was no longer guaranteed. Hours passed, but it felt like days. The forest around him seemed to close in, and the cold gnawed at him with an unrelenting hunger. John stumbled through the snow trying to get his bearings, but his vision blurred from the blood loss and the freezing temperatures. The pain in his side intensified with each step, but he couldn't stop. If he stopped, he would die. That's when he first saw the wolf. It was a gray shape, moving quietly through the trees, its piercing amber eyes glowing in the dim light. For a moment, John thought it was a hallucination, a mirage brought on by the fever and the cold, but the wolf didn't vanish. Instead, it stared at him, its gaze unblinking and steady. At first, John thought of raising his rifle. The military had trained him to eliminate threats, and he knew wolves in this region could be dangerous, but something about the creature's presence stopped him. There was no aggression in the wolf's stance, only curiosity. It stepped closer, its body moving fluidly through the snow, then stopped a few feet away, as if waiting for John to make the first move. For a long moment, neither of them moved. John's breath came in labored gasps, his body teetering on the brink of collapse. The wolf seemed to assess him, then turned, its tail flicking briefly before it disappeared into the trees. John remained motionless, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Had the wolf been real? He couldn't tell, but the idea that the wolf had appeared at the precise moment when John thought he might give up, it was impossible to ignore. The wolf didn't return that night, but as John continued to struggle through the wilderness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly alone. Over the next several days, the wolf appeared intermittently, always staying just out of reach, as if keeping a careful watch over him. John was too weak to understand why this was happening. Why was this wild animal interested in him? But as time passed, he noticed that the wolf's presence wasn't just curious, it was purposeful. John's injuries were worsening, and he was running low on supplies. Every movement hurt. The cold, combined with the blood loss and exhaustion, made him feel like his body was betraying him. He was starting to lose track of time, his mind foggy from the pain and lack of food. One morning, he awoke to find the wolf standing just outside his shelter, watching him. For the first time, John didn't feel fear. Instead, a strange sense of comfort washed over him. He could tell the wolf was no longer simply observing. The creature was trying to help. The wolf led him to a stream, its movements sure and deliberate. There, John found fresh water, and the wolf, through a series of nudges, encouraged him to drink. The wolf then disappeared again, but this time it returned with a small rabbit which it dropped at John's feet. John, amazed and confused, picked up the rabbit. He didn't know what to think, but his hunger took over. He ate the rabbit raw, knowing that survival came before all else. The wolf, watching from the edges of the clearing. But when John had regained enough strength to stand, the wolf was gone. Isaac told John that he had seen this wolf before. It had been coming to his cabin for years, always helping people in need, always guiding lost travelers to safety. "I don't know what it is about that creature," Isaac said, "but it's more than just an animal, it's something else." John eventually made his way back to civilization, but he never forgot the wolf. He often thought about the bond they had shared, the strange and unspoken connection that had helped him survive. He carried the memory of the wolf with him, the memory of a creature who had saved him when he thought there was no hope left. Years later, long after he had returned to a quiet life, John would sometimes hear the distant howl of a wolf in the night. It was a sound that reminded him of everything he had endured, and everything the wolf had taught him: survival, trust, and the power of an unexpected friendship. And though he never saw the wolf again, he knew in his heart that the creature would always be out there, watching over the lost souls of the wilderness. Months passed since John had left the wilderness. He was back home, or at least as close to home as he could be. The city felt like a distant memory, the noise and chaos of civilian life, now an echo that could never quite drown out the quiet of the wild. He had returned to a small town, far from the war, far from everything he once knew. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars remained. The horrors of battle still haunted him, creeping into his dreams and thoughts. It was during one of those sleepless nights, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, that John realized something. The wolf, the creature who had saved him, who had guided him through the Alaskan wilderness, had changed him. John had spent so long trying to suppress his emotions, trying to stay strong, to block out the trauma of war, but the wolf had forced him to confront his vulnerability, to lean on something greater than himself. He had learned to trust again, not just the wolf, but life itself. At night, John would sometimes sit on his porch, his mind drifting back to the wilderness. He could almost hear the wind howling through the trees, feel the chill of the snow on his skin, and see the wolf's amber eyes watching over him, as if it had never really left. The memory of the wolf's silent protection was a constant presence, an unspoken promise that he wasn't alone in this world, even when it felt that way. One evening, while walking through the town, John found himself in front of a small bookstore. Something about it drew him in, a gut feeling, a whisper that urged him to step inside. As he wandered through the aisles, he picked up a weathered book on the lore of wolves. It was filled with stories of the majestic creatures and their untamed nature. But there was one section that caught John's eye. The book spoke of the lone wolf mythology, a story of wolves who were said to help those in need, guiding lost souls back to safety, leading them, not just through the wilderness, but through the darkest corners of their own hearts. John's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page. He wasn't sure what to believe, but the connection between the wolf he had known and the stories in this book seemed undeniable. Perhaps the wolf hadn't just been an animal. It had been something more. A manifestation of something greater than himself, a guide sent to help him heal from the wounds of war, both seen and unseen. Though John had moved on physically, the emotional journey was far from over. The war had left its mark on him, and it wasn't something he could erase, no matter how much time passed. The friendships he'd once had with his comrades had faded. The bond of brotherhood that had once been so strong felt hollow now. John had changed, and he found it hard to relate to those who hadn't experienced the same darkness. Yet, there was something in the way the town around him was healing. There was a peace to it. A sense of quiet that mirrored the stillness he had felt in the wilderness, especially during those long nights with the wolf by his side. The town, much like him, was finding a way to continue, one step at a time, learning how to live again after the destruction of war. But it wasn't just the town that was healing. John himself was slowly beginning to reconnect with the world, to open his heart and mind to new possibilities. It wasn't easy, but the wolf had taught him one crucial lesson. Sometimes, healing wasn't about rushing to the finish line. It was about taking the small steps and letting time work its magic. Much like how the wolf had helped him survive, one moment at a time. A year passed, and the memory of the wolf still lingered in John's mind. He had kept his promise to himself to live fully again. His interactions with others became more genuine. His outlook on life softened.